Good evening. I'm going to address tonight's topic at a bit of a tangent and take the conversation in two directions. First, I'm going to argue that federalism is an important part of the story in relation to health policy and particularly the problems in state public hospital systems. However, the perpetual blame game between the states and the Commonwealth over health funding is a distraction from what should be the main game, which should be a microeconomic reform agenda of the public hospital system. In other words, while federalism might be part of the problem and can be part of the solution by changing incentives, the way public hospitals are run, or should be run, is probably more important than the revenue and function questions that dominate the federalism debate. Second, I'm going to talk about, and probably very briefly, how to reform public hospitals in ways that will help to control their costs and improve their productivity. I will be briefly sketching out the microeconomic reform agenda that will address the major structural problems in the public hospital system, and this solution has been set out in full in the work by me and others as part of the CIS Health Research Program over recent years. My argument here is to say that there is no reason why state governments cannot, and many good reasons why they should, implement this agenda regardless of the shape of the federation. As Anne Twomey mentioned, it's almost 7 years now since Kevin Rudd promised to fix public hospitals and end the blame game during the 2007 federal election. And as we've heard from most of our speakers tonight, the blame game has come back. It's come back with a vengeance following the Abbott government's first budget in May this year for the reasons that Robert sketched out. The changes to federal funding for state health services backtracked on the funding deal that the Gillard government struck in 2011, and that developed out of the Rudd government's national health reform process. The bottom line, which attracted a lot of media attention and a lot of critical comment by state premiers and health ministers, was that federal funding for hospitals will be $15 billion lower than it otherwise would have been under the Gillard government's original deal in 10 years' time. That was those figures that Robert pointed out. Now, the federal share of hospital funding was set to rise by 185%, from $14 billion in 2013-14 to $40 billion in 2024-25. This would have meant that at the end of this period, federal funding alone would have totaled more than combined federal and state government expenditure on public hospitals today. And the reality is that funding for public hospitals has not been cut. Under the new arrangements announced in the budget, federal funding will still grow to $25 billion in 24-25. Moreover, lack of funding or more money lack of funding is not the problem, and more money is not the solution regarding the performance of public hospitals. In the decade between 2002 and 2012, total federal, state and territory government spending on public hospitals grew in real terms by 60%. Annual growth in government spending on public hospitals averaged around 5%, well above average GDP growth. This illustrates the long-term challenges facing the health system. Public hospitals, like Medicare as a whole, face a sustainability crisis. The pressures created by increased demand associated with an ageing population, combined with the increased costs associated with ever more technologically sophisticated hospital care, are compounded by public hospitals' seemingly endless capacity to absorb public funding inputs without delivering a proportional increase in outputs. This problem was well demonstrated by the findings of the 2013 Queensland Commission of Audit, headed by Peter Costello. The Commission found that while expenditure on public hospitals in Queensland had increased 43% in the 5 years since 2007, activity, or the number of patients who were treated, rose by less than half, around 17%. I note that the recent COAG Reform Council report found that despite the large investment in the 4-hour rule, national emergency waiting times have only marginally improved since 2007, and waiting times for elective surgery have lengthened nationally. The lack of improvement tallies with a 2013 report by the New South Wales Auditor General, which found that thousands more patients could be operated on if public hospital theatres were managed more effectively and efficiently. That inefficiency and poor productivity is a problem in all states and territories was tacitly conceded during the negotiations of the Gillard funding deal. Under the terms of the funding agreement, the Commonwealth agreed to increase funding on condition that the states and territories agreed to a national system of activity-based funding. This new system has been characterised as ensuring public hospitals are only funded for the services they deliver and are only paid at the efficient price of delivering these services. However, this terminology is a misnomer. Activity-based funding is designed to pay hospitals for the services they deliver based on the average cost of each type of service across the public hospital system nationally. In theory, this will require hospital managers in the least efficient services to improve operational efficiency and financial performance to the level of more efficient services. However, the so-called efficient price, calculated by averaging the cost across all services, means the new funding arrangement will implicitly underwrite existing inefficiencies embedded in the public hospital system. These include, most importantly, statewide industrial agreements negotiated between state governments and health unions, which set the terms and conditions of employment for doctors, nurses and allied health professionals. These highly centralised and inflexible arrangements are major barriers to productivity as they entrench high-cost and inefficient work practices. This includes strict nurse-to-patient ratios, antiquated demarcation of roles, and the ability of doctors, under the terms of their contracts, to control their own schedules and work practices, including the right to admit private patients to public hospitals. These workplace rigidities deny frontline managers the ability to manage their services in innovative ways that deliver services more cost effectively. This is structural problem number one, lack of proper managerial prerogatives. It's important to point out that the states do have legitimate grievances over federal-state financial relations, particularly regarding health, but only up to a point. Obviously, there is the mismatch between revenue and responsibilities within the Federation. This is exacerbated in health by the fact that the Commonwealth sets the overall policy framework of Medicare, which obliges the states to provide free public hospital services in return for federal health funding. The states, in fact, deserve to be known as Medicare's first victims. In the mid-1970s, the Whitlam government got the states to sign up to Medibank, as Medicare was then called, by committing the Commonwealth to pay for 50% of the real cost of delivering public hospital services. That is, the cost of all services demanded and delivered each year without rationing, queues and waiting lists. The prospect of having their mouths stuffed with so much gold was an offer the states could not refuse. It was also too good to be true and proved to be fool's gold. Under the Fraser government, 50% of real costs became 50% of approved costs, i.e., this was the start of the fixed funding arrangements that became the Medicare agreements under the Hawke government after 1984. Needless to say, no federal government under Hawke, Keating, Howard, Rudd or Gillard has gone close to meeting the original Whitlam promise, with the federal share of hospital funding traditionally hovering around 40% of the total cost of rationed public hospital services. There is no doubt that Medicare left the states in an invidious situation. Medicare increased demand for free public hospital services as private health coverage declined. Moreover, the states were left to try and meet this demand as the real value of Commonwealth funding progressively dwindled. The only option to contain ever-growing and potentially unlimited health expenditure was to cap spending by rationing free care. Rationing care required altering the administrative arrangements for public hospitals. Traditionally, each public hospital had been managed by their own board of governors. Prior to Medicare, public hospitals had also been a major public administration headache for state governments, since hospital boards frequently overran their budgets and left state treasuries to foot the bill. To exert stricter financial control in the free Medicare environment, boards were abolished and public hospitals were placed under the control of regional bureaucracies, also known as the area health services. The new administrative structure created a range of new problems, including large amounts of bureaucracy and red tape and disempowered frontline managers. In effect, since the 1980s, public hospitals have been run under a command and control regime and as branch offices of state health departments that have high levels of involvement in all operational matters. Moreover, the area health system perpetuated the same core problem that existed under the hospital board setup. Financial risk, or rather financial responsibility for hospital budgets, ultimately remain the responsibilities of the state. This is structural problem number two. Lack of proper financial accountability and incentives for good management to deliver services cost effectively. These structural problems are the real issue in relation to sustainability. In all jurisdictions, health consumes around 1/3 of state budgets and public hospital spending accounts for around 2/3 of total health spending. The New South Wales Auditor-General has famously found that if spending on health continues to grow at current rates, health will consume the entire state budget in 20 years' time. What this really means, as one former state treasurer once put it to me, is that no government, federal or state, has enough money to sustain the projected cost of public hospital services. This implies the potential solutions related to federalism that sought to clarify blurred health responsibilities, spanning everything from a full federal takeover to a full devolution of health responsibilities and appropriate income taxing powers to the states, is not really a solution. Under either scenario, the same unaffordability problem and reform challenges would remain. What this implies is that regardless of whatever tax and function realignments occur, this is no substitute, and there is no substitute, for tackling the reform and productivity challenges in public hospitals. There is no alternative to figuring out how to bend the projected cost curve down and increase the amount of services delivered for the funding available and reduce the quantity of public resources consumed by public hospitals. I would fully support, however, altering federal relations along the federalist lines suggested by Robert, Anne and Nick. Realigning tax and function powers would give the states greater incentive to undertake reform. As a first step, I reckon it would be worth exploring ending all specific purpose payments, or conditional grants as they're now being called, and giving the states one pot of money, as this might encourage state governments to make more rational decisions about how best to use scarce public resources amid competing priorities, and this might extend to the operation of public hospitals. As I understand it, conditional grants largely operate as a make-work program for state and Commonwealth public servants. Not only would abolishing conditional grants immediately cut down on the bureaucratic costs associated with accountabilities to Canberra, minimising the state's ability to point directly to the inadequacies of federal health grants might, and I stress might, also diminish the power of the lack of funding excuse which the states have perpetually hid behind while failing to address public hospital reform. Technically, this arrangement would leave the future of Medicare, as far as free public hospital care is concerned, as a matter to be determined by each state according to the will of the electorate. Political reality, however, might dictate caution and calculation as the better approach. Reaffirming the national commitment to Medicare might also be the political price that has to be paid to achieve any change on the federalism status quo. But I want to stress my original point. I would think that the prospect of bankruptcy ought to be sufficient incentive for state governments to undertake reform. What might this look like? The structural problems plaguing public hospitals reflect the fact that the system is run as a rigid public service monopoly model, and like all monopolies, the system is inherently inefficient. The way out of this situation is to think of microeconomic reform as a three-stage process involving 1, creating a purchaser-provider split, 2, corporatising public hospitals under truly independent and accountable boards, and 3, introducing competition and contestability via privatisation of public hospital facilities. State health departments are both the funder and provider of hospital services. Reorientating the system towards more market-based arrangements requires transforming the traditional role of health departments into a purchaser of hospital services. The first stage of microeconomic reform, a purchaser-provider split, depends on the second stage, the corporatisation of public hospitals. This requires devolving managerial and financial accountability, including financial risk for each public hospital, to their own board of management, with full control over all operational matters and full responsibility for the hospital's entire budget. This could be achieved by emulating the Foundation Trust hospital governance model introduced in the UK. Foundation Trust boards have the power to borrow and are responsible for debt incurred, and they can accumulate reserves as a reward for efficiency. Their solvency is monitored by an independent regulator. Importantly, managerial autonomy and financial accountability under a corporatised system would mean giving hospital boards and their managers full control over the employment terms and conditions of their workforces. Workplace flexibility is essential if independent management and financial accountability are to be meaningful, as this is essential to allow innovation to occur and to allow competition to drive efficiency and productivity improvements. Competition through privatisation is the third element. Selective privatisations via public-private partnerships for new or redevelopment hospital projects would inject competitive pressures into the mix. This would create a contestable market for public hospital services and give state health departments the ability to act as informed purchasers. The ability to purchase services from better performing private operators would encourage public facilities that remain in state hands to lift their game and emulate the more efficient and business-like practices of their private competitors. Some steps, uneven steps, in some of these directions are being taken in various jurisdictions. Welcome developments include the public-private partnership entered into by the New South Wales Government for the construction and operation of the new public hospital at Frenchs Forest, as recommended by me and David Gadiel, CIS's Senior Fellow, in our report of 2012 on how the New South Wales Coalition should govern health. However, the legacy of the Rudd national reform process is not as promising. As part of that process, the states agreed to set up new administrative organisations under the name of local hospital districts, replete with their own boards. This was presented as a devolution of management to the local level and an end to command and control bureaucracy. What it has actually proven to be is another reinvention of the area health system. To take New South Wales as the example, there has now been 5 administrative restructures in the last 30 years involving the creation and recreation of area health districts of varying size and location. But under all these configurations, including the latest, the same structural problems have remained. The New South Wales Health Department has remained the overall system manager with high levels of involvement in operational matters, and LHD boards and managers have lacked real managerial independence and financial responsibility because financial risk continues to be carried by the state. This means that LHDs continue to lack both the authority and incentive to commercially manage their facilities and exert proper control over hospital finances. More importantly, control over the health workforce remains a departmental responsibility, which means that rigid statewide employment agreements and restrictive work practices remain in place, limiting opportunities for innovation, productivity improvements, and enhanced cost effectiveness. What all this means is that the political quarantine that has protected the public health sector from the kind of structural reform that has become commonplace in other government instrumentalities remains in place. There remains a lack of political will to take on the vested interests of public sector health workers who have long benefited from government employment in public hospitals on the terms that suit them. Public hospitals therefore remain the major public administration challenge facing the states, and there remains no substitute for political leadership at the state level that will set vested interests aside and pursue the public interest in containing health expenditure and maximising the state's return on spending on public hospitals. Thank you.